St. Louis, January. The kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. A city of 2 million people moving through their Tuesday. Collars up, eyes down. Nobody stopping for anything they don't have to stop for. On the corner of Walnut and 11th, a pharmacy door swings open. An old man steps out. 81 years old. Wool coat, polished shoes. A cane that taps the concrete like a metronome, steady, unhurried, as if time itself had agreed to slow down for him. He doesn't see the lace. Across the sidewalk, a boy on a bench sees it immediately. 12 years old, navy sweatshirt, a paperback he isn't reading. Eyes that have learned, recently and not gently, to watch everything. He has been sitting on that bench since 9 in the morning. It is now 2:17 in the afternoon. He watches the old man take one step, then another. On the third step the lace catches, and the boy stands up.
There are moments in a city that no one is meant to see. They happen at corners and in doorways and along the edges of crosswalks where strangers wait for lights to change. Most of them dissolve into the noise of the street before anyone can decide what they were. A nod between strangers, a hand steadied on a railing, a child stepping back to let an elder pass. These things happen, and then they are gone, absorbed into the ordinary texture of a city that keeps moving regardless of what small graces occur within it. But on a Tuesday afternoon in January, on the corner of Walnut and 11th in downtown St. Louis, Missouri, one of those moments happened, and it did not disappear. It would travel further than anyone standing on that corner could have imagined. And it began the way most things that matter begin, with something very small. The man who stepped out of Gordon's pharmacy that afternoon was 81 years old, though he carried his age the way certain old trees carry theirs, not as diminishment, but as evidence. He wore a long camel-colored wool coat that fell almost to his ankles, a charcoal scarf wound twice around his neck, and a pair of Oxford brogues the color of dark molasses, polished to a quiet shine. His hair was the soft, deliberate white of a winter field at first light, and he wore a flat tweed cap that he tugged a little lower whenever the wind came up off the Mississippi. His name was Clarence Webb. He was by the measure of most people who knew him a wealthy man. He was also, by the measure of the few people who knew him well, something considerably rarer than that. He paused on the curb to let the wind settle. He looked down once at his shoes, the way old men look down at their shoes when something feels not quite right, then looked up and began to walk. He did not see that the lace of his left shoe had come undone somewhere between the prescription counter and the front door. He did not see the long end of it, trailing 2 feet behind him through the gray slush of the January sidewalk, picking up grit and ice as it went. He did not see the boy on the bench across the sidewalk, who had been watching him from the moment he came through the door. Clarence Webb had been coming to Gordon's pharmacy on the first Tuesday of every month for more than 30 years. Gordon himself, a man of 72 who had pharmacied in this same building since before Clarence's hair turned white, was the only pharmacist left in the city who still hand-wrote labels on prescription bottles. Not because the law required it, because Gordon believed a person deserved to know who had touched their medicine. Clarence could have had his prescriptions delivered. A service would have done it for free given who he was. He preferred Gordon. He preferred the small bell above the door and the smell of old wood and clean linoleum, and the way Gordon always asked before anything else, how the roses in Clarence's garden were doing, even though the roses had not been there in 7 years, and Gordon knew it, and Clarence knew that Gordon knew it, and neither of them said so. The asking was a kindness that lived in the not saying. That was the kind of man Gordon was. That was the kind of man Clarence Webb had spent his life seeking out and holding close. He moved now at his own deliberate pace, the cane tapping a calm rhythm beside him on the concrete, as if to remind the sidewalk that it was being crossed. He walked the way certain men walk when they have long since made peace with their own speed, not defeated by slowness, but settled into it, the way a river settles into its bed after the spring flood recedes. He did not notice the lace. The boy on the bench had noticed it before Clarence took his second step. His name was Marcus Elliott. He was 12 years old, and he was thin in the way boys are thin when they have grown too fast for the rest of themselves to catch up long wrists that came out past the cuffs of a navy-hooded sweatshirt, a chin tucked into his collar against the wind. He had a worn backpack sitting across his lap and both arms folded over the top of it, and a paperback book balanced on top of his arms, open to a page he was not really reading. The St. Louis Public Library had not opened that morning. A burst pipe in the basement. A handwritten sign on the front door that said, "Closed, sorry for the inconvenience." Marcus had stood in front of that sign for a long moment, then walked 3 blocks to the bench in front of Gordon's pharmacy because the pharmacy's awning threw a little extra shelter from the wind, and because the bench was out of the worst of it, and because he had learned over the past several weeks that the most important skill in the city in January was knowing where the wind did not reach. He had been on that bench since 9 o'clock in the morning. It was now 2:17 in the afternoon. He watched Clarence the way a boy his age watches anything in a city in winter, the way you watch when you have nowhere in particular to be and watching costs nothing. There was a particular quality to his stillness that was not quite ordinary for a 12-year-old. Most boys his age fidgeted. They shifted, checked their phones, pulled at their sleeves, looked around for something to distract them from the fact of sitting still. Marcus did none of those things. He sat with the particular, self-contained quiet of someone who had learned recently and not gently that stillness conserved warmth. He saw the lace before the third step. It was the kind of lace that had been tied 10,000 times by the same pair of hands and had finally decided on this particular January afternoon that it was through being tied. The bow had slipped somewhere between the prescription counter and the sidewalk, and now the long, dark end of it trailed 2 full feet behind Clarence's left shoe, sliding through the gray slush with the slow indifference of something that did not yet know it was about to cause trouble. Clarence took 1 step. He took another. On the third, the trailing end of the lace caught for one brief instant on the iron lip of a storm drain, and he felt the faintest tug at his ankle, and he stopped. He looked down. He saw what had happened. He let out a soft, almost amused breath, the exhale of a man who has been surprised by his own body enough times to recognize it as an old familiar adversary rather than an enemy. Then he assessed the situation with the quiet, methodical precision of someone who had spent 81 years solving problems. The cane was in his right hand. His right hip had decided 3 winters ago that it would no longer carry him without assistance, and the cane was the treaty they had negotiated. The paper bag was in his left hand. It contained a small glass bottle that Gordon had wrapped carefully in tissue paper, and Clarence had no intention of setting it down on a wet sidewalk. The bench was occupied by a boy in a navy sweatshirt. The concrete planter nearby was crusted with a rim of dirty ice. The pharmacy door was 8 feet behind him. He had just concluded that going back inside to ask Gordon for a chair was the most reasonable option when a voice arrived at his left elbow. It was a boy's voice, not yet broken, carrying the particular quality of someone who has thought carefully about how to say something before saying it. "Sir, your lace came undone. Let me get that for you." Clarence turned his head. The boy was already there, already lowering himself down onto one knee on the cold, wet pavement in a single unhurried motion that suggested he had done this kind of thing before and saw no reason to make ceremony of it. He had set his backpack down beside him on the curb. The paperback was tucked under his arm spine, pressed against his ribs. His hands' knuckles reddened from the cold. The skin, a shade lighter at the joints where it had been stretched thin, moved with a calm, deliberate certainty that Clarence had not seen in a very long time. "You don't have to do that." Clarence said it in the soft, ceremonial way a person says a thing they don't entirely mean, the way you decline a second helping at a table where you've already decided to accept one. The boy didn't look up. He was looking at the lace, working the slush gently off the long end, pinching the wet section between thumb and forefinger to wring it out before he began. "It's all right, sir. My dad showed me a good knot for boots that walk in bad weather. It holds in the wet if you want me to use that one." He paused just long enough to check whether the offer had landed properly, then looked back down. "It's a little different from a regular knot, but it stays." "I would be very grateful for a knot that stays," Clarence said. The boy nodded once to himself and began. Clarence watched. He watched the way a man watches when something unexpected has stopped him, not with casual interest, but with the full, unhurried attention of someone who has learned to recognize the difference between an ordinary moment and one that matters. He watched the careful crossing and looping of the lace, the small, precise motions of a knot being tied, the way a knot is supposed to be tied, not rushed, not careless, but deliberate, as if the tying itself was a kind of compact between the tire and the shoe. And then Clarence's chest did a thing it had not done in a very long time. He recognized the knot. It was a knot he had not seen tied since a cold Sunday afternoon in a darkened kitchen in Harlan County, Kentucky in the winter of 1957. He had been 12 years old. His father, Henry Webb, who worked the second shift at a coal mine 6 days a week and wore his calluses the way some men wear medals, had sat across from him on a low wooden stool, holding his own boot in his lap, and shown him step by step how to make this particular knot. The one that held in mud and snow, in the kind of rain that came sideways off the hills. "Can't always trust the weather," Henry Webb had said. "Can't always trust the road. But you can trust a knot you tied yourself if you tied it right. That's a small promise you make to yourself in the morning. You make it before you walk out that door, and you carry it the whole day." 69 years ago, Harlan County, Kentucky. The recognition moved through Clarence's chest before his mind had fully caught up to it. A slow, warm pressure, like a hand laid gently against an old scar. He stood very still on the sidewalk. He did not speak. He did not want the moment to end any sooner than it had to, because the moment contained something he could not yet name, something that had to do with kitchens and winter light, and the careful hands of men who had been dead a long time. The boy pulled the second loop through, snugged it down, and patted the bow once lightly the way you pat a jar lid to check that it's sealed. Then he sat back on his heel for a moment, studying his work with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has completed a small task properly. He rose in one smooth motion, picked up his backpack as he came, and stepped back the appropriate distance and waited. His jeans had a wet patch at the knee where he'd knelt. He didn't look at it. He didn't call attention to it at all. Clarence looked down at his left shoe. The knot was tied tight, and even the loops sitting at exactly the same length, the long ends tucked neatly beneath the lacing so they would not drag again. It was the knot Henry Webb had called a teamster's bow, though Clarence had heard other men in other places call it other names. He had not seen it tied on his own foot since the morning his father had died when he was 34 years old, and had sat on the edge of his childhood bed in that same Harlan County house and done it one last time. He looked up at the boy. He took his time about it. The boy was perhaps an inch shorter than the cane. His eyes were the dark, steady brown of river water under an overcast sky. There was a small old scar on his lower lip that puckered slightly when he held his mouth still. He held his backpack strap with both hands, now fingers laced over it, a posture that managed to be simultaneously casual and braced the posture of someone accustomed to waiting to find out how an interaction was going to end. "That is a fine knot," Clarence said. He meant every word of it. "Your father taught you well." Something shifted in the boy's face. Not dramatically, not the way faces shift in movies, with visible flinching or brightening. Just the faintest movement, like a curtain stirring when a window has been opened in another room. "Yes, sir," the boy said. 2 words. The kind of answer that is also a closing. The kind of closing that a careful person hears and does not push against. Clarence heard it. He adjusted the paper bag in his left arm and said, "My name is Clarence Webb." The boy turned the name over for a moment, not out of recognition, which Clarence noted with quiet satisfaction, but with the particular consideration of someone deciding how to receive a thing. "I'm Marcus Elliott." Marcus. Clarence tried the name the way you try a word in a new language with care feeling for its weight. "That's a name with some history in it. A patient name." Something unexpected happened to the boy's expression at that. Not a smile, not quite. More like the brief softening of something that had been holding itself carefully in place. "My mother said it meant a gift," he offered. He offered it lightly, the way you set a delicate thing on a table when you're not sure whether it belongs there. The word said, past tense, quiet as a door pulled closed on an empty room. Clarence heard that too. He did not turn toward it. He glanced at the book tucked under the boy's arm, the way old readers glance at books in any hand reflexively before they can decide not to. The spine was bent from many readings. A library sticker half peeled and curling at one corner, the title visible despite the wear, The Call of the Wild. "That is a very good book," Clarence said. Now the boy's eyes changed, not dramatically, but with the quality of a window opened in a room that had been closed for some time. "It's my second time through it," he said. "The library was supposed to open today, but a pipe burst. They let me keep it longer." "A burst pipe, Clarence said, "is a reasonable excuse to read a good book twice." He paused. My hip has been reminding me for the last 10 minutes that I've been standing on a curb in January for too long. There's a coffee shop 2 doors down Murchison's. The coffee is genuinely bad, but the chairs are warm and the woman who runs the place doesn't mind if a person sits a long while. He held the boy's gaze. Would you walk with me? Marcus went still in a particular way, not the stillness of refusal, but the stillness of internal accounting. He looked at the cane. He looked at the paper bag. He looked at the polished Oxford shoes with the careful new knot on the left one. He looked at the old man's face, the deep-set eyes, the unhurried quality of his waiting, the complete absence of any pressure in the question. The part of Marcus that had tied the knot decided before the rest of him had finished thinking it through. Yes, sir, he said. I can walk with you. They walked. Clarence moved at his own pace, the cane keeping its quiet rhythm on the concrete, and Marcus fell into step beside him, half a step behind on Clarence's left, matching the pace without planning to the way you match the rhythm of a song you've heard before. The wind pushed against them from the river steady and gray, carrying the particular coldness of January in a river city. A delivery truck idled at the curb ahead of them. A man in a canvas coat unloading boxes stepped aside to let them pass without being asked. They did not speak during those 2 doors worth of sidewalk. There was no need. Murchison's had a bell above the door that rang with the tired sound of something that had been ringing for decades and had long since made its peace with that. The shop was long and narrow, wedged between a tax office and a shoe repair place. The chalkboard menu had not been updated in a season. The chairs were old wood worn smooth at the armrests. The wall heater behind the counter had been working since mid-morning, and the warmth had built up slowly into something that was not merely comfortable, but genuinely restorative, the kind of warmth that finds its way into cold fingers before you've realized it started. The woman behind the counter looked up from her newspaper. She was perhaps 62 with wire-rimmed glasses pushed up into short gray hair and the unhurried expression of someone who has been running the same counter long enough to recognize most of what walks through the door. Clarence Webb, she said. I was about to send out a search party. Ruth, Clarence stopped at the counter. The first Tuesday came and went. My hip and I had a disagreement about whether to leave the house. Ruth's attention moved to Marcus with the same uncomplicated warmth she'd offered Clarence. She did not look at the wet patch on the knee of his jeans. She did not look at the worn sole on his left shoe. She did not look at the sweatshirt thin for the temperature. She looked at his face precisely, and only at his face, and what she found there seemed to satisfy her in some way she did not explain. And this young man, this is Marcus. He kept me from walking the length of Walnut Street with a lace trailing behind me. Clarence set the paper bag on the counter for a moment to ease his grip. We came for a place to sit if you can spare one. The corner booth, Ruth said without hesitation. And I can spare a hot chocolate if Marcus would like one and a cup of the bad coffee if Clarence insists on it. Yes, please, ma'am. The words came out of Marcus before he had decided to say them, ahead of the careful, deliberate pace he kept for most things. Hot chocolate was a phrase that had not been aimed in his direction in a long time, and his body answered before his caution could catch up. He said it, and then stood very still for a moment, the way you stand when you've moved faster than you intended. Ruth smiled at him the way a person smiles when someone has said exactly the right thing without knowing it. She lifted the hinged section of the counter and waved them toward the back of the shop, with the air of a woman showing guests to a table she had been keeping for them all afternoon. The corner booth was a high-backed wooden bench against the far wall with a small round table, worn smooth by many years of elbows, and a window beside it that looked out onto a narrow side street, where a single street lamp had already begun against all reasonable expectation for the hour to flicker on in the early gray. Clarence lowered himself into the booth by stages the way a tall man with a difficult hip lowers himself into anything. He set the paper bag carefully on the bench beside him. He leaned the cane against the wall. He let out a long breath, the kind a man releases when the standing portion of his afternoon is finally behind him, and gestured at the bench across the table. Sit, Marcus. Take your coat off if you like. We're out of the wind now. Marcus slid into the bench opposite. He set his backpack on the seat beside him with the practiced instinct of someone who had learned not to put bags on the floor in public places. He kept his sweatshirt on. The shop was warm, properly warm, and he could feel it beginning to reach his fingers. But he had also learned that removing a sweatshirt in a warm place was a thing you could not easily undo when the warm place ended. He placed his hands flat on the table on either side of the space where the cuffs of his sleeves met the table's surface, and he waited in the particular way he had learned to wait, not fidgeting, not checking anything, simply present, watching the old man across from him with the dark, steady eyes that had in the last 2 months learned to read rooms the way certain people learn to read weather. Ruth brought the hot chocolate in a thick white mug with a small ceramic snowman painted on the side. The coffee came in a heavier mug with no decoration. She also set down 2 small plates. No one had asked for plates, and on each plate was a thick slice of something dense and dark with a crumble of brown sugar across the top, still warm enough to be giving off a thin thread of steam. "Banana bread came out of the oven 20 minutes ago," she said by way of an explanation that was also a fait accompli. "I'd have to throw it away otherwise. You'd both be doing me a kindness." She did not wait for a response. She turned and walked back to her newspaper in the way a person turns away from a thing they have decided is not open for further discussion. Clarence picked up his coffee and held it between his palms for a moment before drinking, holding it as much as drinking it for the warmth. He nodded at the banana bread on Marcus's plate. "She has been offering me that same excuse for 26 years, he said. "She has not yet succeeded in throwing any of it away." "It smells very good, sir." "Then please," Clarence said, "before it gets cold." Marcus did not need to be told twice, though he held himself to a small, deliberate pace. The pace of a boy who had decided somewhere in the past several weeks that there were certain things he was not going to let strangers see in his face. He picked up the fork. He cut a corner of the bread. He chewed slowly. He did not close his eyes the way he wanted to, because closing his eyes would have given too much away. He took a small, careful sip of the hot chocolate, set the mug down, cut another corner of bread. Clarence did not watch him eat. He turned his face slightly toward the window, and this too was a kindness Marcus did not yet have the words for, though he felt it somewhere in his chest, the way a body feels warmth through a wall before the room itself is warmed. Outside, the snow had begun. Not the uncertain drifting of the past hour, but actual snow now falling in the steady rhythm of a winter that had found its purpose. A woman across the narrow street pulled her coat tighter and ducked into a doorway. The street lamp that had flickered hesitantly earlier had committed fully now, its yellow light laying a long rectangle across the wet pavement below. "Your father taught you that, not?" Clarence said after a quiet while. He was still looking at the window. "May I ask when?" Marcus set down his fork. He looked at his hands. "When I was 8, sir." "That's a good age to learn a knot like that." A pause. The street outside was quiet now, the snow absorbing some of the city's noise. Marcus turned the mug a quarter turn on the table without drinking from it. "He said I had to be old enough to want to do it right." Another quarter turn. "He was a long-haul driver. Said the knot was for boots that had to walk through bad weather." He paused. "He said a good knot was a small promise you made to yourself in the morning." The last sentence landed differently than the others. It landed the way something lands when it has traveled a long way to get there. Clarence set his cup down in its saucer. He turned from the window. He took his time. "My father taught me that knot," he said, "in a kitchen in eastern Kentucky, the winter of 1957. He was a coal miner." He folded both hands on the table. "He said something very close to what your father said. Different words, but the same idea. He said a knot tied right in the morning was the only thing you could be certain of for the whole day." Marcus looked up. His eyes were very wide, and in them was something that Clarence recognized, not surprise exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has heard something they were not expecting to need. "He said that almost word for word." The silence that followed was not an empty silence. It had weight to it, in texture, and the specific quality of a silence shared by two people who have both understood simultaneously that something more than conversation is happening. "Some things," Clarence said quietly, "don't change much from one good man to another." Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked down at the banana bread on his plate, half of it gone now, and at his hands on either side of it. Then Clarence watched something happen that he had seen before many times over many decades in many different kinds of rooms, the moment when a person's control over their own face reaches its limit, and the body decides without permission to be honest. Marcus pressed his lips together. He picked up his fork. He cut another small piece of bread that he no longer particularly wanted because cutting the bread gave his hands something to do, and his hands were still the part of himself he could manage. His eyes, without any instruction from him, had begun to fill with the kind of slow, warm water that he had been refusing them for weeks. Clarence saw it all. He saw the pressed lips and the picked-up fork and the careful cutting of a piece of bread that would not be eaten. He saw the reddening at the lower rim of the boy's eyes. He saw the jaw held tight. He had seen this particular shape of small private grief in boardrooms and at gravesides, and once, a very long time ago, in the back of an army hospital, in a country that no longer existed by the same name. He knew, with the precision of a man who had spent his life learning when to speak and when to let silence carry the heavier load, that the only useful thing he could do in this moment was to look at the window and pretend for one respectful minute that he had noticed nothing at all. He turned his face to the snow. He watched a woman in a dark coat cross the street below. He watched the street lamp's reflection stretch and ripple across a puddle in the gutter. He counted the snowflakes accumulating along the corner of the windowsill without meaning to count them. He held his coffee. He waited. When he turned back, Marcus had set the fork down. His hands were folded in his lap. His eyes were dry the way the eyes of a boy who has practiced are dry, with only the slight redness at the lower rim to say what had been there a moment before. "I'm sorry, sir," Marcus said. "I didn't mean to do that." "You didn't do anything, Marcus." Clarence set his coffee cup down with the careful deliberateness of a man placing something where it belongs. "There's nothing to be sorry for. It's just that I haven't talked about him in a while." A pause. "Or about any of it." "How long is a while?" Marcus looked at the table. He thought about it genuinely, thought about it the way you think about something you've been carrying for so long you've stopped measuring its weight. "2 years, sir. Almost exactly 2 years." Clarence nodded. He picked up his cup again, mostly to give his hands their own occupation. Outside, the snow had thickened. The woman who had been walking below the window was gone now. The street lamp had given up competing with the gray and simply committed itself to being the best small light it could manage in the particular dark it had been given. "My father taught me that knot on a Sunday afternoon in December," Clarence said. "He died when I was 34. For a long time after, I couldn't think about that kitchen without feeling something I didn't have a word for." He looked at the window. "I still don't have a word for it exactly, but I know the shape of it." Marcus looked up. He said nothing. But the way he looked up said something. "There's no rush," Clarence said simply. "We have bad coffee and good banana bread, and nobody is waiting for either of us." And Marcus, who had been moving from place to place for 53 days, keeping to himself, not staying anywhere too long, not telling anything to anyone, because no one had sat still long enough for the telling, looked at the old man across the small round table and found to his own surprise that he believed that. Outside, the snow fell in the steady, patient way of a winter that has decided to be a winter. Inside Murchison's, the radiator behind the counter ticked its small, reliable ticks. Ruth turned a page of her newspaper. The street beyond the window was quiet, and the banana bread had gone cold, and Clarence Webb held his cup of bad coffee and waited with the particular patience of a man who understood that some things, like some knots, cannot be rushed into holding. What Marcus was going to say next, he had not said aloud to a single person in 53 days. But something about the weight of a shared silence, something about the specific, unhurried quality of being waited for, rather than simply being present, had begun very quietly to shift the ground beneath the thing he had been carrying alone. The snow kept falling. The radiator kept ticking. The street lamp held its small light steady against the gray. The snow had not let up. It fell against the narrow window beside the corner booth with a patience that suggested it had nowhere else to be, layering itself in small white ridges along the outer sill, the way things accumulate when no one is watching them closely enough to stop them. Inside Murchison's, the radiator kept its quiet rhythm. Ruth had not turned a page in several minutes. The street beyond the glass was empty now, the way a city street goes empty on a Tuesday afternoon in January when the weather makes its opinion known. Marcus turned the mug another quarter turn. The ceramic snowman on its side rotated out of view, then came back around. He had been doing this without thinking, rotating the mug in small increments, a slow, unconscious orbit for the last several minutes. Clarence had noticed. He had not mentioned it. "My father died when I was 10, Marcus said. He said it the way a person says something they have rehearsed privately many times but never performed for an audience. Not rehearsed in the theatrical sense, rehearsed in the way a person goes over a hard thing in their own mind, in the dark until the shape of it becomes bearable. The words came out level, contained, carrying their weight without spilling it. Clarence did not move. He held his coffee cup with both palms, and he listened with the particular quality of attention that Marcus had by that point already begun to recognize the full, unhurried kind. Not waiting for a pause to respond. Not constructing a reply while the other person was still speaking. Simply receiving the way good ground receives rain. Truck accident, Marcus continued. Night rain, outside a town in Texas called Pecos. He was on a long haul heading back. The mug made another quarter turn. I didn't find out until the morning. My mother got the call at 2 in the morning, but she didn't wake me up. She waited until the sun was up. A small pause. I asked her later why she waited. She said she wanted me to have one more night's sleep before the world changed. The radiator ticked. Snow pressed against the glass. She was sick already when he died, Marcus went on. Not bad yet, but sick. Afterwards, it moved faster, like it had been waiting for something to happen before it decided to get serious. He looked at the table. She said it wasn't connected. The doctors said it wasn't connected, but I was 10. I thought things were connected. Sometimes they are, Clarence said. Marcus looked up at that. Not with surprise exactly, but with the attentiveness of someone who has been handed something they need to examine more closely. Clarence met his eyes. Not the way we think they are when we're young, Clarence said, but the body knows things the doctors can't always measure. Your mother knew what she'd lost. That matters. It always has. The boy considered that. He turned it over in the careful way he seemed to turn most things, not quickly, not impulsively, but with the methodical deliberateness of someone for whom thinking had become out of necessity a form of survival. Then he looked back at the table. She died in November, he said. The 3 words fell into the space between them, the way stones fall into still water, not violently but with a weight that displaces everything around them. Clarence absorbed them without shifting, without changing his expression, without doing any of the things people typically do when they've been handed grief and don't know where to put it. He simply received. I was at the hospital, Marcus continued. They let me stay. There was a nurse on the overnight shift. Her name was Brenda. She brought me a blanket at some point and didn't ask me any questions. I remember thinking that was the nicest thing anyone had done for me in a while. He stopped. My mother she was awake at the end. She knew I was there. He stopped again, longer this time. That part I'm glad about. Ruth turned a page at the counter. It was the softest sound in the room, barely audible, and yet it was precisely right, the sound of someone being present without being intrusive, of a space being held open without being forced. There were supposed to be people who came, Marcus said. After. There were several people who said they would come. A woman from our church. An old friend of my mother's from before we moved to St. Louis. My dad's sister, Aunt Cora, she lives out in University City. He rotated the mug again. They all said they were coming, but the days went by and it was the holidays, and then it was January, and nobody had come yet. His jaw tightened briefly. I'm still waiting. Clarence set his cup down with great care, as if the act of placing it precisely on the saucer required full attention. In another man, it might have looked like avoidance. In Clarence Webb, it looked like what it was, a man steadying himself against the weight of what he had just heard. In the meantime, he said, his voice very even, where are you staying? Marcus looked at his backpack on the seat beside him. He ran one thumb along the strap, a short back and forth motion, then stopped. He looked at the window. He looked at the half-eaten banana bread on his plate. He looked at the old man across the small round table, at the deep-set eyes holding no judgment, the hands resting open on the table, the complete unremarkable stillness of a person who has asked a question and is genuinely prepared to wait for whatever answer comes. Marcus had not told anyone. Not the social worker with the clipboard who had written his name down in December and said the caseload was very full. Not the librarian who had let him keep the book an extra week without explanation. Not the man at the soup kitchen on Olive Street who had asked kindly whether he had somewhere to go. He had answered each of them with a variation of fine. He'd said it enough times that the word had lost its texture entirely. It meant nothing now. It was the sound a person makes to close a conversation. But he had been watching Clarence Webb for 40 minutes. He had watched the way the old man listened. He had watched the way he looked out the window when Marcus needed a moment, the way he did not fill silence with reassurance, The way he had said some things don't change much from one good man to another, with the tone of someone who had earned the right to say it. He had watched and he had taken inventory. And what he had concluded without quite forming it into words was that this was a person for whom truth did not appear to be dangerous. "There's an apartment," Marcus began. His voice was level. He kept it level deliberately, the way you carry a full glass across a room you don't want to spill in. "It was my mother's. The rent is paid through the end of January. A woman from her church helped with that. I have a key. I go there sometimes." He paused. "But the woman in the apartment below has been asking the building manager about me. The manager's been asking her back. I know what that means. Sooner or later, someone is going to knock on that door, and whether I answer or don't answer it won't go well for me either way." He looked at the table. "So mostly I don't sleep there at night." At the Yishomum. Clarence said nothing. He waited. "There's a laundromat on Chouteau that runs all night. The man on the late shift, he's maybe 30, plays music on his phone with one earbud in. He lets me sit in the back room if I stay quiet. There's a parking structure near the arch. Fifth floor stairwell has a heater vent. If I get there before 10, it's usually empty." He turned the mug again. "The library opens at 9. I move around. I try not to be in any one place long enough for someone to ask questions." He said all of this in the same contained, methodical tone he had used to describe his father's death. It was not the tone of someone performing stoicism. It was the tone of someone for whom stoicism had become, through practice, an ordinary mode, a way of moving through a reality that had not softened itself to accommodate his age. "Food," Clarence said quietly. "The kitchen on Olive Street. They serve at noon and 5. They don't ask much if you come to the back door." Marcus glanced down. "Sometimes I have a little money from before my mother passed. She had a coffee can at the back of the kitchen cabinet. I've been careful with it." He touched the front pocket of his sweatshirt briefly, then dropped his hand. "I bought this at Goodwill in December. $4. The radiator ticked. The snow kept falling. Clarence placed both hands flat on the table. Not dramatically, not with the force of a man receiving a blow, but with the deliberate, grounded quality of someone who has heard something that requires a moment's full reckoning before any response is possible. He looked at his own hands for a moment. The knuckles still bore the evidence of years, the slight swelling at the joints, the dark undertone of skin worn long and well. Henry Webb's hands had looked like that toward the end. He thought about a kitchen in Harlan County. He thought about the specific texture of cold in that kitchen in December, the way it got into the baseboards, the way his mother would heat the stove early just to make the room bearable by the time his father came home from the second shift. He thought about what it had meant to be 12 years old in that house, in that county, in that particular decade, and how many varieties of hard there were in the world, and how few of them looked like what people imagined when they pictured hardship from a comfortable distance. He thought about his wife. She had always said that the boys this age were the ones the world stopped paying attention to too soon. Not the very young children who inspired protection instinctively, and not the older teenagers who could at least advocate for themselves with some volume. The ones between the ones old enough to be expected to manage young enough to still be entirely without resources. Those were the ones she had worried about most. She had said that many times, over many years, in the kind of offhand way that people say the things they mean most deeply. She had been gone 7 years. He still heard her in sentences like that. "Marcus," Clarence said, "I want to ask you one more question. You don't have to answer it." "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you tell anyone before now? Before me, I mean." The boy was quiet for a long moment. He rotated the mug one more quarter turn. The snowman completed another slow orbit. "The social worker had a clipboard," he said finally. "She wrote down my name. She said the system was full and I should be patient." He paused. "The woman at my mother's church said she would pray for me. The man at the Olive Street kitchen told me about the youth shelter. But I heard things about that shelter from a boy who was there. I didn't want to go." He stopped. He looked at the window where the snow had built a small, soft ridge along the bottom of the outer sill. "So I just kept going. I thought if I kept going long enough, something would work itself out. My aunt would call back. The cousin in Memphis would answer. The social worker would remember." A pause. "Most days I still think that." He turned from the window and looked at Clarence directly. His face was steady. He had not cried. There was something in his eyes that had no business being there in a 12-year-old, something that had arrived from outside the ordinary progression of growing up and installed itself early. You're the first person who asked me a question and then stayed quiet long enough to actually hear what I said. He held Clarence's gaze without flinching. I think that's why. What happened to Clarence Webb in the moment that followed was not visible on his face. He had spent 8 decades learning to receive difficult things without inflicting his reaction on the person who had delivered them. But inside the long coat and the deliberate stillness and the worn patience of his 81 years, something moved, something that had not moved in a while, something he recognized from only a handful of other moments in his life. The specific gravity of a thing that matters landing. He thought about the small company he had started in 1978 with 4 employees in a rented building on the east side of Louisville, Kentucky. He thought about the meetings he had sat through in the years that followed, the hundreds of decisions, large and small, that had accumulated into a life of consequence. He thought about the things that had mattered in the end, not the contracts, not the quarters, not the growth reports, but the small decisions made quickly in the cold, before a stranger who needed something he could provide. He had made a dozen of those decisions over the course of his life. He recognized this as one of them. I'm going to tell you what I'd like to do, he said. Then I'm going to ask whether you'll allow it. Not tell you, ask. Marcus said nothing. He waited. The first thing is a phone call. There's a woman named Doris Callahan who has worked alongside me for 31 years. She's an attorney, but she doesn't look like one. And when she's not in a courtroom, she doesn't talk like one either. She is the most capable person I know in the area of family court in this city. She will know who has your file, why it hasn't moved. And this is the part that matters. She'll know exactly which call to make to get it moved to the top of the stack before the end of the week. He paused. That's the first thing. Marcus held still. The second thing is to ask Ruth, who I have known since her husband was alive, whether she'll let us use the telephone in the back office and whether she'll let you stay in this booth warm while I make that call. I don't expect it to take more than an hour before Doris arrives. He glanced toward the counter. Ruth, would that be all right? Ruth did not look up from her newspaper. I'd consider it an honor, her voice carrying the easy certainty of someone who had been listening to the whole conversation and had been waiting for the question. The third thing, Clarence continued, is what I want to ask your permission for specifically. He turned both palms upward on the table, an old gesture open and unhurried. I have a house. It's too large for one person, and it's been too large for one person for 7 years now. On the lower floor, there's a room with a bed in it, clean linens, and a window that looks out onto a garden. The door to that room has a lock. The lock operates from the inside. He held Marcus's gaze. You would be the only person with the key. He stopped. He let that settle. I want to say that again because I believe it's the most important part. The door locks from the inside. The key belongs to you. Not to me. Not to the woman who keeps the house. To you. You could lock it every night or never lock it at all. That would be entirely your decision, not mine. He folded his hands. What I'm offering you is that room. For tonight and for as many nights as it takes Doris to find the right next step for your situation. The snow pressed against the glass. The heater ticked. You would not be a guest earning his welcome, Clarence said. You would not be a project. You'd be a young man under my roof. The door would lock from the inside. I've now said that 3 times, and I'll say it as many more times as you need. Marcus looked at him steadily. You can say it once more, he said. I'm still hearing it. Something shifted in Clarence's expression. Not quite a smile, but something in the territory of one. The door locks from the inside, he said. The key is yours. The boy held his gaze for another moment. Then he looked at the table. Now, Clarence continued, his voice the same even temperature it had held throughout. The offer of the room is entirely separate from the offer of Doris's help. Doris will make those calls whether you accept the room or not. That help is not a condition of anything. If you say no to the room, I'll still call her. She'll still come. Ruth will still let you sit here as long as you'd like. I'll drive you anywhere in this city you want to be taken. He paused. The room is just the room. The help is just the help. I want you to hear them as 2 separate things before you answer. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Not the silence of hesitation, but the silence of someone working through something carefully, the same methodical quality he brought to everything. He looked at the backpack beside him. He looked at the book still tucked under its strap, the library sticker half curled at the spine's corner. He looked at the mug with the ceramic snowman. Then he looked at Clarence Webb. Looked at the long camel coat, the charcoal scarf, the hands resting open on the table. Looked at the polished Oxford shoes, visible beneath the table's edge. The left one bearing a tight, even teamster's bow. "Who are you?" he asked. "I mean, I know your name, but who are you?" Clarence let out a breath that was almost a laugh, not from amusement, but from something adjacent to relief. The exhale of a man who has been expecting a question and is glad it has finally arrived in a form he knows how to answer honestly. "I grew up in a town in Kentucky that doesn't exist under the same name anymore," he said. "Most of those towns don't. I started a small company in Louisville when I was 33. We made parts for grain elevator systems. Agricultural work mostly. Over time, it grew the way some things do when you keep showing up and paying attention. It does different things now. I retired from running it some years back, though I go to the office on Wednesdays because the chairman is my son and he's patient with me." He looked at Marcus steadily. "By most people's measure, I'm a wealthy man. I don't tell you that to change anything between us right now. I tell you because you asked who I am, and I believe you're owed an honest answer before you decide anything." The boy absorbed this in the particular way he absorbed most things, without visible reaction, turning it over internally, checking it from multiple angles before arriving at any conclusion. He looked at the shoes again, the coat, the carefully wrapped paper bag on the seat beside Clarence. Then he looked at the old man's face. "I tied your shoe because your lace was undone," Marcus said. His voice was quiet. "I didn't know who you were." "I know that. I would have done it the same way if you'd been anyone." "I know that too." Clarence's voice dropped to something very low, very steady. "That is the exact part of you, Marcus Elliott, that I am sitting across this table on account of." The boy sat with that for a moment. His jaw was no longer tight. His hands resting on the table had lost the coiled quality they'd carried throughout the readiness to pick something up, to cut something smaller, to keep some part of himself occupied so the rest of him could hold. He looked for a few seconds like what he actually was, 12 years old in a warm place being seen without condition. He picked up the mug of hot chocolate. His hand was steadier than it had been any other time in the past hour. He took a slow sip, set the mug down, looked at the snow on the windowsill, the small, soft ridge that the wind had stopped bothering to undo. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'd like to come to your house tonight." He paused just briefly. "Thank you." Clarence nodded once. The same small, contained nod he had given when Marcus finished tying the lace on the sidewalk, the nod of a man for whom a small but consequential agreement had been reached. He raised one hand slightly toward the counter, and Ruth, who had been turning the same page of her newspaper for the past 12 minutes without reading a word of it, looked up with the unhurried calm of a woman who had been waiting precisely for this signal. "Ruth, may I use the telephone and back?" "Of course, Clarence. Would you be willing to keep Marcus company while I do?" Ruth set down her newspaper. She came around the counter, lifted the hinged section, and walked to the corner booth in the easy, unrushed way of someone doing something that needed no ceremony. She sat down across from Marcus in the seat Clarence vacated with the comfortable directness of a woman who had spent a long life in a narrow coffee shop, learning that most of what people needed was simply for someone to stay. Clarence rose by stages, cane in his right hand, moving down the narrow corridor at the back of the shop, toward the small office where Ruth kept a landline telephone she had refused across 3 separate decades to give up. He did not hurry. He did not need to. Ruth looked at Marcus across the small round table. Outside, a plow truck moved slowly through the street, its yellow light strobing briefly against the window. Ruth waited until the light had passed. "He's a good man," she said. "I've known him since my husband was alive. He used to come in Tuesdays for the coffee, Thursdays for the apple cake." She folded her hands on the table. "There are not very many like him left, Marcus. I've been watching people walk through that door for 26 years, and I can tell you that plainly." Marcus looked at her. "The coffee is really that bad?" Something opened up in Ruth's face. Not a laugh, something quieter than a laugh, but warmer. "It is genuinely terrible," she said. "He comes back anyway. That tells you something about a person." Marcus looked down at his mug. The hot chocolate had cooled enough to drink without caution. He wrapped both hands around it and held it the way Clarence had held his coffee at the beginning for the warmth itself, because the warmth itself was worth having. It was just a lace, he said. He wasn't looking at Ruth. He was looking at the window, at the snow still falling, in the particular unhurried way it had been falling for the past hour, as if it had been waiting for permission. It was not just a lace, Ruth said. Her voice was entirely matter-of-fact, the voice of someone stating something they have no doubt about. But you don't have to know that yet. Doris Callahan arrived 46 minutes later. The bell above the door announced her with its tired ring, and she came through in a long navy coat, dusted white at the shoulders, carrying a leather satchel over one arm, a thermos in her opposite hand, and a pair of reading glasses pushed up into graying hair that had been cut short enough to stay out of her way. She looked nothing like the word attorney. She looked in the particular combination of her expression and her posture like someone who had been doing difficult, necessary work for a very long time and had simply stopped distinguishing it from the rest of her life. She saw Marcus in this corner booth before she had fully unwound her scarf. Her face arranged itself into something direct and warm. Not performatively warm. Not the warmth of someone managing a situation, but the specific warmth of someone who has been told over the phone in the back of a coffee shop by a man she has trusted for 31 years that there is a boy in a corner booth who has been holding something too heavy alone for too long. She did not extend her hand. She sat down beside Marcus on the same side of the booth, not across from him, with the ease of a person who had learned through long experience that the geometry of a conversation shapes its content. Sitting beside someone was different from sitting opposite them. Across was a negotiation. Beside was a partnership. "You must be Marcus," she said. "I'm Doris. Clarence called me from the back." She set the satchel on the table. "He said the two of you had quite an afternoon." "Yes, ma'am. I want to tell you something before we do anything else." She looked at him steadily. "I'm on your side, not Clarence's side. I know where that man sleeps at night, and he doesn't need an advocate. Not the agency's side, not the city's side, not the system's side. Yours." She held his gaze. "Whatever calls I make in the next few days, whatever letters I write, whoever answers the phone, I am working on your behalf. Do you understand that?" Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Not quickly, not reflexively. He said it the way he said the things he meant. "Good." She clicked open the satchel and produced a small black notebook and a pen. "Then tell me what you've told Clarence and whatever else you haven't yet, and we'll start from there." Marcus told her. He told it with the same contained, methodical voice he had used with Clarence, but more quickly now, with slightly less of the long pauses between sentences, as if the first telling had carved the path and the second moved along it more easily. Doris wrote in her notebook in a small, precise hand. She asked questions, careful, specific questions, the kind that demonstrated she had been listening to every word and needed only certain details clarified rather than repeated. Ruth brought a fresh mug of hot chocolate for Marcus without being asked. She brought Clarence a new cup of bad coffee when he returned from the back office, moving quietly into his vacated seat at the end of the table. He sat with the particular stillness of a man who had done what he could do and was content now to be still while others did what they could do. By the time they left Murchison's that evening, Doris had made 3 phone calls and left 2 messages and written down 4 names she intended to speak with before 9 o'clock the following morning. The apartment where Marcus's mother had last lived was quietly secured by a man Doris trusted entirely, who confirmed by text message before they reached the car that no one would knock on that door until Marcus and Doris were the ones doing the knocking. Clarence's car was parked half a block from the pharmacy. It was a dark blue sedan several years old with the interior kept in the particular order of a man who used things carefully rather than replacing them often. Marcus sat in the back seat with his backpack across his lap. The city moved past the windows, lit storefronts, bare trees, a traffic light at an empty intersection swinging in the wind. The snow had thinned to something more like mist now, the kind that didn't accumulate but softened every surface it touched. Nobody spoke during the drive. Clarence drove the way he walked deliberately at his own pace, with no apparent concern for the fact that other people on the road were moving faster. Marcus watched the city go by. Ruth had wrapped up the remaining banana bread in a square of foil and pressed it into the outside pocket of his backpack before they left. He had not asked her to. She had done it the same way she brought the second mug of hot chocolate quietly without fanfare, as if it were simply an obvious thing. The house at the end of the lane, east of the city, was not what Marcus had been picturing during the drive. He had been picturing something that matched the shoes, something formal with visible expense, the kind of house that announces what it cost. What he found instead was a long, low stone house with a wide porch and a porch light that had been left burning, casting a warm yellow circle on the snow below it. There was a wreath of dried lavender on the front door. The driveway was shoveled clean. The garden visible to the left of the house was covered in white and still. Vera met them in the entrance hall. She was a woman of perhaps 65, with the kind of face that had arranged itself over time into an expression of practical warmth. Not sentimental, but genuine. She wore a blue cardigan and kept her reading glasses on, as if she'd been pulled away from something she intended to return to shortly. On the narrow table beside the door sat a small plate of shortbread. She looked at Marcus with the direct, uncomplicated attention she probably gave most things. "Welcome," she said. "Your room is ready." She did not say his name as if it were a performance of knowing it. She did not make any other kind of fuss. She had been, Marcus would understand later, in the company of Clarence Webb long enough to know that a boy arriving at a strange house in the snow did not need an occasion made of it. She showed him down a short corridor on the lower floor. The room was at the end of it. The door was open. Inside, a window looking out onto the garden under its layer of new snow, a bed with a wool blanket folded neatly at the foot, a small desk with a reading lamp, a bookshelf with a few volumes arranged without particular system. The room was warm. Not the accumulated warmth of a large space struggling to hold heat, but the immediate, reliable warmth of a room that had been prepared with the intention of being warm when someone arrived. Vera pointed to the lock on the inside of the door. She did not explain it. She simply pointed to it the way you point to an exit in a building, making sure it was seen, making sure its presence was understood. Then she told him there was a bathroom across the hall, that breakfast would be at 7:30 if he wanted it, and later if he didn't, and that she would be in the kitchen if he needed anything before morning. Then she left. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at the room. He looked at the window, at the garden beyond it, at the snow falling again now, in the thin, quiet way it fell when the temperature was dropping. He set his backpack down beside the desk. He walked to the door. He examined the lock, an ordinary interior lock, the kind operated by a small lever on the inside. He turned it once slowly, just far enough to feel the mechanism engage. The bolt slid home with a soft, decisive sound, the sound of something doing what it was designed to do. He held it there for a moment. Then he turned it back. Unlocked. He stood in the doorway again, looking at the room, the lock, the snow. Something in his chest had shifted, not dramatically, not with the force of a revelation, but with the slow, quiet quality of something that has been braced for a long time, beginning in the presence of genuine safety to unbrace. Like a muscle that has held tension so long, it has forgotten what rest feels like now, feeling the possibility of it for the first time. He did not lock the door that night. He did not lock it any night afterward. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, tested the mattress with both palms, looked at the wool blanket, looked at the window where the snow had begun again in earnest, landing against the glass, with the softest possible sound, not even a sound, really more the suggestion of one. Somewhere in the house something was cooking. He could smell it faintly, something that involved butter or something adjacent to butter, something that required warmth and time. He listened for Vera moving in the kitchen. He heard her softly at the far end of the house. He lay back on the bed without removing his sweatshirt. He looked at the ceiling of a room that was not a laundromat, was not a parking structure stairwell, was not a lobby or a doorway or any of the other places where a person was technically present, but not anywhere at all. The ceiling was plain white plaster with a hairline crack in the far corner that had been there long enough to become part of the room's character rather than a defect. He looked at it. He did not close his eyes immediately. He lay still, listening to the house the way you listen to a new place when you are trying to learn its sounds, what to expect, what to ignore, what belongs. The radiator in the corner knocked once, settling. A door opened and closed somewhere far off, Vera probably. The snow continued against the glass. Marcus was asleep before he had decided to be. He woke before the alarm he hadn't set. The ceiling was still plain white plaster with its single hairline crack in the far corner, And for a moment, just a moment in the gray space between sleep and waking, Marcus did not know where he was. Then the smell reached him, coffee, something with butter, the faint trace of wood smoke from somewhere in the house. Not the antiseptic neutrality of the laundromat's back room, not the cold concrete smell of the parking structure stairwell, something else entirely. Something that required a kitchen and intention and a person who had decided before he was awake that he was worth feeding. He lay still for another minute. The wool blanket was on top of him, though he had no memory of pulling it up. The reading lamp on the desk was off. Through the window, the garden held its cover of snow in the early morning light, pale blue-white, the particular color of undisturbed cold. The door was still unlocked. He had not moved it in the night. He sat up, folded the blanket back with the automatic neatness of someone accustomed to leaving spaces the way he found them, and went to the window. The garden below was still. A single set of bird tracks crossed the snow near the far fence, small, precise, already half filled by a new dusting that must have fallen in the early hours. The sky above the bare trees was the color of old pewter, the specific gray of a day that has not yet decided what it means to be. He was still wearing his sweatshirt. He found the small bathroom across the hall, washed his face with water cold enough to be clarifying. Looked at himself in the mirror for a moment. His eyes looked different than they had in the last bathroom mirror he'd used, a truck stop restroom off Highway 43 weeks back early on a Sunday morning. He had not looked at himself in that mirror for long. He looked at himself in this one a little longer. He could not have said exactly what was different. Something in the quality of his own gaze, perhaps. Something that had overnight stopped expecting the floor to shift. Vera was in the kitchen when he came down the hall. She stood at the stove with a spatula in one hand and a dish towel over her shoulder, wearing the same blue cardigan as the night before, or one so similar it made no practical difference. She did not look up immediately when he came in, which he found without being able to articulate why exactly right. She gave him the room to arrive on his own terms. 7:30, she said, turning from the stove with a plate. You made it. He sat at the table. She set eggs and toast in front of him. She poured orange juice without asking. She sat down across from him with her own tea and her newspaper, and she did not require him to perform gratitude or comfort or sociability. She read. He ate. The kitchen held its warmth around them both. After a while, without looking up from the paper, do you read much? Yes, ma'am. There's a good library in University City. If you end up staying in that direction, it's worth knowing about. She turned a page. What kind of books? He thought about it. Stories, he said, about people going somewhere they didn't expect to go. Vera looked up at that. She considered it with the unhurried attention of a woman who had long since stopped feeling the need to fill silences quickly. That's most of the good ones, she said and returned to her paper. Marcus ate all of his eggs. He had not eaten a complete breakfast, had not sat down to one in a room with another person at a table that belonged to a home in 54 days. He did not think about that while he was eating. He thought about it afterward when Vera took both plates to the sink and he was left with his empty orange juice glass and the particular quality of full that is different from merely not hungry. He sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with something unfamiliar that turns out to be good. Doris arrived at 9:30. She came through the front door in the comfortable way of someone who had used it many times, knocking once. As she opened it, her navy coat exchanged for a dark green one that had not yet shed its cold from the drive. She set her leather satchel on the kitchen table, produced the same small black notebook, clicked the same pen, and got to work. She had made 2 calls before 8 o'clock that morning. The first was to the family services supervisor whose name she had pulled from the agency's directory, not the intake worker, not the receptionist, the supervisor. She had introduced herself, stated that she was representing a minor currently in the care of a responsible adult, identified the case by number, and asked a single question. Could the supervisor explain why a completed guardianship application, submitted in December by a biological relative, had generated no response in over 6 weeks? The silence on the other end of the line had told her most of what she needed to know. She had thanked the supervisor and said she would follow up in writing by end of business. The second call had reached Cora Elliott at 7:48 in the morning at the University City address where she taught 4th grade at a school 3 blocks from her apartment. Cora had answered on the second ring. Her voice, Doris told them now at the kitchen table, carried the particular tension of someone who had been bracing for a long time against news that had not yet come. the tension of someone waiting but not sure anymore what they were waiting for. When Doris said that Marcus was safe, was physically well, was sitting in a warm house east of the city with people who were looking after him, the line went quiet, not the silence of disconnection. The silence of a person receiving something they had been carrying the weight of not receiving for weeks. Then, Cora Elliott had said, "Does he know I've been trying to find him?" Doris had said not yet, but she would know as soon as Marcus did. Marcus sat at the kitchen table and listened to this. He sat very still. His hands were flat on the table surface, both of them palms down, the position of a person who is making sure they are connected to something solid. Clarence sat at the far end of the table. Vera stood near the stove. Doris held her notebook open but was not writing in it. The kitchen was warm. The house around them was quiet. "She wasn't waiting for someone else to call her," Marcus said. His voice was careful, very careful, in the way of someone approaching a thing they have decided to approach but have not yet decided to trust. "She submitted the application December 3rd, Doris said. The system logged it as received. Then it was routed incorrectly, sent to a field office that handles adult cases, not juvenile placement. By the time it was flagged as a misdirection, it had been sitting for 2 weeks. She called the main number 3 times in December, left messages with 2 different intake workers. Neither of them called back." She paused. "That is a failure on the part of the agency, Marcus, not on hers." He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He worked through something privately that the rest of the room gave him space to work through. Clarence did not speak. Vera did not move. Doris held the quiet the way a skilled attorney holds a room with authority without pressure. "She didn't forget," Marcus said. He was not asking. "She did not forget," Doris confirmed. "She has not stopped." What happened to Marcus Elliott's face in that moment was not dramatic. It did not collapse. It did not transform. Something in it simply released very quietly, the way a knot releases when the right amount of steady pressure is applied in exactly the right direction. Not a sudden giving way. A slow, considered loosening. The thing he had been carrying, the specific corrosive fear that he had been misplaced permanently, that the people who should have come had weighed the cost of coming and decided against it, set itself down very gently and became something he no longer had to hold. He looked up. His eyes were clear. "When can I talk to her?" Doris looked at her watch. "She teaches until 3. I told her I would have you call this afternoon." She closed the notebook. "Unless you'd rather I ask her to come here." Marcus thought about that for a moment. He thought about a kitchen table and a drive across the city and a woman he had met 3 times in his life, once at his father's funeral, once at Thanksgiving 2 years before that, once at the hospital in November when Cora had driven up from University City and sat with him for an afternoon in the corridor outside his mother's room, not saying much just there. He thought about the way Cora had pressed his hand when she left that day. The specific pressure of it, something held and then released. "Ask her to come," he said. Doris was already reaching for her phone. The morning passed in the particular way that mornings pass when important things are being organized in the background and the foreground is quiet. Marcus sat in the chair by the garden window in the room at the end of the hall reading. Vera had brought him 2 books from a shelf in the sitting room. She had not explained her selections, simply set them on the desk with the same practical care she applied to everything and left. One was a novel about a man who walked across the country after the death of his wife. The other was a collection of letters written by ordinary people during the years of the Great Depression, letters to neighbors, to relatives in other states, to strangers who had shown them unexpected kindness. He read the letters. They were short, most of them written in the functional prose of people who did not have paper to waste. But they were precise in a way that longer writing sometimes was not. They said exactly what they meant because they could not afford to say more. A woman in rural Ohio thanked a man she had never met for sending a pair of shoes that fit her son. A man in rural Georgia described in 4 sentences how a stranger had stopped to help him fix a broken axle in the rain, had refused payment, had driven away before he could be thanked properly. The man had been trying. He wrote to find the stranger ever since. He had not found him. He had decided to help 3 other strangers in his place, and he was writing to report that he had so far managed 2. Marcus read that letter twice. Then he sat for a while with the book closed on his lap, looking out at the garden. He was still sitting there when he heard a car in the driveway at 2:30. He did not go to the window. He sat where he was listening to the sound of a car door, then footsteps on the porch, then the front door. Voices in the entrance hall, Vera's low and welcoming, and another one he recognized before he could fully separate its individual qualities from the general sound of it. He knew it the way you know the voices of the few people who have sat with you in the worst moments of your life. The body remembers before the mind catches up. He was standing in the kitchen doorway when Cora Elliott came around the corner. She was 49 years old, his father's youngest sister, with the Elliott family's dark eyes and a way of holding herself that suggested she was usually in the middle of several things at once and had learned to be composed about it. She was wearing a charcoal wool coat and carrying a bag over one shoulder, and she had clearly not stopped for anything between leaving her school and driving across the city, because her hair was still in the pulled-back arrangement of a woman who had been at a chalkboard all morning. She stopped when she saw him. She went completely still. He was taller than she remembered. He was thinner than she remembered. He looked older than 12 in a way that had nothing to do with his face and everything to do with what lived behind it. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and put her arms around him. She did not say anything first. She did not prepare a sentence. She simply came to him the way a person comes to something they have been afraid of losing, with the particular urgency of relief, which is different from happiness, different from comfort, carrying its own specific weight. Marcus stood in the circle of her arms. His backpack was still over one shoulder because he had not thought to set it down before coming to the doorway. He stood there with the backpack on and his arms at his sides for a moment that stretched past its ordinary length. Then he put his arms around her. He did not close his eyes. He looked at the kitchen wall over her shoulder, the plain white wall, the small frame photograph of a garden in summer that Vera had probably chosen because it balanced with the window rather than for any other reason. He looked at it. He blinked twice slowly. He did not cry. He had done something harder than crying over the past 2 months. He had kept going. He was still going. This was not an ending. It was a place to stop moving long enough to remember what standing still felt like. Cora pulled back after a moment. She held his face in both hands the way his mother had done, the same gesture, and looked at him with the dark Elliott eyes that were so much like his father's that it required a specific, deliberate adjustment to look into them without flinching. "I have been looking for you," she said. Her voice was steady in the way that steadiness costs something. "I want you to know that. Every day." "I know," Marcus said. He meant it. They sat at the kitchen table for the rest of the afternoon. All 5 of them. Cora, Doris, Clarence, Vera. Marcus in the warm kitchen with the winter light going amber through the windows as the afternoon moved toward its close. Ruth had sent a container of soup with Clarence that morning pressed into his hands in the Murchison's parking lot before he left. Vera heated it. It sat in the center of the table in a large ceramic pot, and nobody made a ceremony of serving it or eating it. They simply ate when they were hungry, because that was the kind of afternoon it was. Doris ran the practical portion with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. She laid out what she knew about the status of the guardianship application. She explained what the next steps looked like in plain language, without abbreviating the complexity, but without amplifying it into something frightening. She had already drafted a letter to the agency's regional director. She had the name of the family court judge who would handle the placement hearing. She had a timeline. The timeline was real, not the soft, provisional kind of timeline that institutions produce to manage expectations, a real one, with dates with the names of specific people responsible for specific actions, with a clear statement of what Doris intended to do if those people did not perform those actions on schedule. Marcus sat at the table through all of this. He was asked his preferences at every decision point, not in the performative way that adults sometimes ask children as a courtesy gesture, with the expectation that the adult's judgment will prevail regardless, but in the actual way where his answer genuinely shaped the outcome. Where to live while the paperwork was finalized. Whether he wanted to stay in his current school district or transfer. What he wanted to bring from the apartment before the lease expired. He answered carefully. He had good answers, it turned out, because he had been thinking about these things alone for 54 days with no one to tell them to, and they had clarified in his mind the way things clarify when they have been thought about long enough. Clarence mostly listened. He spoke 3 times during the afternoon, once to clarify something in the timeline with Doris, once to ask Cora a question about her school schedule that turned out to be relevant to the logistics of the hearing date, Once near the end of the afternoon, when Marcus had been asked for the third time about what he wanted and had answered for the third time in the same careful, considered way to say something that had nothing to do with logistics. "He's good at knowing what he wants," Clarence said. He was looking at Cora when he said it, but it was not a statement directed at her. It was a statement offered to the room the way you offer something you want to be heard without insisting on it. "That's not nothing. A lot of people twice his age aren't." Cora looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the table. Something about the geometry of that moment, the old man's observation, the ant's look. The boy's carefully maintained composure had the quality of a thing being named properly for the first time. Cora came back the following Saturday with a Greyhound ticket stub in her coat pocket and a rental car reserved for the drive home. She spent the intervening days in a guest room that Vera prepared with the same unhurried competence she applied to everything. She spent those days with Marcus, taking walks in the snow, eating breakfast at the kitchen table, visiting the library in University City that Vera had mentioned. Cora had a library card. She got Marcus a temporary pass. He checked out 3 books. Doris filed the corrected application on a Thursday. The family court hearing was scheduled for February. By the end of February, the judge had signed the temporary placement order. By the middle of March, Marcus was enrolled in a school 4 blocks from Cora's apartment in University City, carrying the backpack that had now acquired a small keychain, a brass rectangle with the word Elliot stamped into it, which Cora had pressed into his hand on the first morning without explanation. Because some things do not require explanation. The apartment had 2 bedrooms. Cora had been using the second one as a study. She moved the desk to the living room without comment. She put a bookshelf in the bedroom because she had spent enough time with Marcus by then to know that a room without bookshelves was a room that was not quite finished. He put The Call of the Wild on the top shelf, still the library's copy. The late fee had been forgiven. He kept it anyway because some things earn their place on a shelf through what they witnessed rather than what they cost. He finished middle school in Cora's neighborhood. He finished high school there too, steadily, without particular drama, the way a person completes a journey they are serious about, 1 mile at a time, paying attention to the footing. He volunteered on weekends at the Olive Street kitchen, the same one where he had come through the back door asking no questions. He worked the noon shift. The man who ran the service recognized him by the 3rd week and did not say so for another month. When he finally did, when he looked at Marcus across the serving counter with the specific look of someone placing a face they've been trying to place, he said, "Only you're back." Marcus said, "Different door." The man nodded like that was exactly the right answer. Clarence came to his high school graduation. He drove himself, which Vera had argued against, and which he had declined to argue about in return. He simply got in the car, and that was that. He sat in the 3rd row with Vera beside him, Doris at the end, Cora in the front with 4 colleagues from her school who had come because Cora had mentioned it once in the teacher's lounge with the quiet pride of someone who doesn't fully realize they're being proud. When Marcus walked across the stage, Clarence clapped. He did not stand. Standing was a production, now a sequence of careful negotiations between intention and anatomy, and he had decided some years back to reserve it for moments that truly required it. He would stand for this boy another time, he knew. He was content for now to sit straight and clap with the same precision he brought to most things. Marcus did not look for him in the crowd. He found him anyway, the way you find the faces you have memorized, not by searching, but by arriving at them naturally, the way water finds the low point of a field. He went to the University of Missouri on a scholarship that covered tuition, housing, the first year's books. The scholarship came from a fund called the Webb Foundation for Children in Transition. The fund had been established in 1998 and had supported, by the time Marcus received his award letter, 11 other students. Marcus did not know this when he accepted. He did not know who had established it. The scholarship committee's correspondence came from a post office box in Clayton, Missouri. He found out the truth the autumn after graduation when Clarence died. He had driven to the stone house on the Thursday before. Something had told him to go some internal register that had no name, and had sat with Clarence on the porch in the thin October light that was almost warm almost. Clarence had been quieter than usual. Not the quietness of withdrawal, the quietness of a man who has said most of what he needed to say and is now in the comfortable business of simply being present in a world he has inhabited fully. They had talked about Marcus's thesis. He had written it on gaps in the juvenile placement system, specifically on the ways that correct applications from willing relatives were lost in routing errors and what structural changes to intake processing could prevent it. His faculty advisor had called it the most practically useful thesis she had supervised in 11 years. A policy organization in Jefferson City had asked for a copy. Clarence had listened to all of this. When Marcus finished, the old man looked out at the garden. The roses were still going late season, a few of them holding on with the particular stubbornness of something that has not been told to stop. "You're going to do good work," he said. It was not a prediction. It was not encouragement. It was the simple declarative sentence of a man who had been watching another person carefully for years and had arrived at a conclusion. Clarence Webb died on a quiet Tuesday morning in October in the stone house at the end of the lane, with Vera in the kitchen and Doris 20 minutes away on the highway. Marcus was with him. He had driven back on the Monday evening, some pull in his chest that he did not examine too closely, just packed a bag, got in the car, drove. He sat beside the bed and held Clarence's hand. The room was warm. The garden window showed the morning light on the last of the roses. At some point, the breathing in the bed changed its quality, became something other than breathing in the ordinary sense, and then it stopped. Marcus sat for a long time after. He did not feel the need to move. The room held what it held, and he sat in it, and it was enough. On the Oxford brogues at the foot of the bed, the left shoe wore a teamster's bow. Vera had tied it that morning. Clarence had asked her to because he could no longer bend far enough, but he wanted the shoes on the bed because he was particular about things being as they should be. The will was read 10 days later. Most of it was the orderly disposition of a long, carefully managed life. Near the end, there was a letter. The envelope had Marcus's name on it in Clarence's handwriting, which had grown smaller and more deliberate over the years, but had never lost its precision. Marcus read it alone in the garden in the thin autumn light. The letter was short. It said, "You tied my shoe on a sidewalk in the cold when no one else would have stopped. You did not know who I was. You would have done it for anyone. That is the only kind of kindness that has ever changed anything in this world, the kind that doesn't require knowing who someone is first. Be that kind of person for someone else. Marcus Elliott. Everything else will follow from that." There was a second page. It documented the Webb Foundation, its history, its 11 previous recipients, the endowment structure, the terms of succession. It named Marcus as the fund's new trustee. He folded both pages, put them in the inside pocket of his coat against his chest, sat in the garden for a long time. The last roses were still there, 3 or 4 of them, at the far end of the bed near the stone wall, holding on in the October air, with a tenacity that seemed disproportionate to their size. He thought about a laundromat on Chouteau Avenue. He thought about a parking structure stairwell and a heater vent in the specific cold of January pavement through the knees of thin jeans. He thought about a clipboard. He thought about the phrase, "the system is very full," and what it meant when a person heard it at the age of 12 alone, without anyone on their side. He thought about a woman named Brenda who had brought a blanket in a hospital corridor without asking any questions. He thought about Ruth, who had turned the same newspaper page for 12 minutes so a boy in a corner booth could have the sound of someone present without the weight of someone watching. He thought about Doris, who had sat beside rather than across. He thought about Vera, who had pointed to a door lock without explanation and let the gesture speak for itself. He thought about all the forms that care takes when it is practiced by people who understand that the most important part is often not the large thing, but the small one, the turned page, the pointed lock, the seat chosen deliberately on the same side. He knew what he was going to do next. He had known for some time. 2 years after Clarence died, Marcus opened a small office on Del Mar Boulevard in University City, in a narrow storefront between a print shop and a tax preparer, with a second-hand desk and 2 donated chairs and a telephone and a laptop. He called it the Teamster's Bow. The name was not on the door for the first 3 months because he had not yet found someone to make the sign affordably. And during those 3 months, he discovered that the absence of a name on the door made no difference to the people who needed to find it. They found it anyway. The word traveled the way words travel among people who are used to finding things by necessity, not through formal channels, but through the informal networks of the desperate and the compassionate, which overlap more than most people realize. Jess was his first hire. She was 22 with a work history that began at 17 and a personal history that had begun requiring navigation considerably earlier than that. She had slept for 6 weeks in a laundromat in Cincinnati when she was 14 different city, same shift workers' quiet mercy. She knew what she was doing before Marcus explained it to her. Devin came next 3 months later. He had been Cora's student in fourth grade 9 years back. He had not stayed in University City. He had gone, came back, gone again, came back again, in the way of people who have a place that is theirs, but have not yet figured out how to live in it properly. Cora had mentioned his name to Marcus on a Sunday afternoon with the particular casualness of a person who is not being casual at all. Devin had the gift, it turned out, of sitting very still in rooms where children were trying to say something difficult. He could hold a silence the way Clarence had held silences with authority without pressure, making space rather than filling it. Marcus recognized it the first week Devin was there and did not waste time telling him so. The first case that came through was a boy in East St. Louis, 11 years old, who had been sleeping in the downtown library branch for 9 days before a librarian noticed the pattern and called the number she had found on a flyer in the break room. Marcus handled it himself. He drove across the river on a Wednesday evening and sat in the library with the boy for 2 hours in 2 chairs pulled together near the periodicals section where the light was good. The boy's name was Antoine. He did not talk much the first hour. The second hour, he talked more. By the time the library closed, Marcus had enough to start making calls. Antoine was placed with a great-uncle in Belleville within 3 weeks. The great-uncle had not known Antoine existed until Doris, still operating, still precise, still capable of making institutional inertia move through the specific application of direct documented pressure, made a call to a family services coordinator and asked the right question. Marcus drove to Belleville 6 weeks after the placement on a Saturday afternoon to check in. The great-uncle answered the door in a kitchen apron and shook Marcus's hand with a grip that communicated something beyond courtesy. Antoine was at the kitchen table with homework spread in front of him. He looked up when Marcus came in. He did not say anything. He nodded once, the specific economical nod of someone who has decided that a thing has been received and acknowledged. Marcus nodded back. Same economy, same meaning. He drove home through the late afternoon light with the heat on in the car and the radio low and the particular quiet in his chest that he had come to recognize as the opposite of emptiness. Not fullness exactly, not satisfaction. Something more durable than either of those, something that had to do with alignment, with being precisely where you had decided to be, doing precisely what you had decided to do. 3 years after opening on a Tuesday afternoon in January, he drove to Murchison's. He had not been back since the night Clarence drove him east along the highway to the stone house at the end of the lane. He had thought about going back many times. He had not gone for reasons he had never fully examined. It did not seem like the kind of thing that required examination. It seemed like the kind of thing that required the right moment, which he had apparently been waiting for without quite realizing it. Until he found himself on Walnut Street at 2 in the afternoon on the first Tuesday of January, parking in the same block where Clarence had parked his dark blue sedan 5 years before. The pharmacy was still there. Gordon's name was still on the sign. The sign looked more weathered, but the letters were still clear. The bell above Murchison's door still rang with its tired, reliable sound. The shop was the same long, narrow room, same chalkboard menu, same worn wooden chairs. The wall heater behind the counter was doing what it had always done, building warmth slowly into something worth having. Ruth looked up from the counter. She was older. Her hair was a shade more silver cut the same way. The reading glasses were still pushed up into it. She looked at Marcus for a moment, the direct assessing look of a woman who has spent a long professional life recognizing people at the remove of a few years, and then something arranged itself in her expression. "Marcus Elliott," she said. "I wondered when you'd come back." "I'm sorry it took this long," he said. "Don't be." She came around the counter. "You were busy, Clarence told me. He came in every Tuesday until the hip made the drive too hard. He always mentioned you." She said it plainly, without sentiment, the way you report a fact. Then, "He was proud of you." He didn't say that word because he never said that word about anything. But that's what it was. Marcus looked at the corner booth. The same high-backed wooden bench, the same small round table. The window beside it showed the same narrow side street, and the street lamp was doing what it had done that first evening, committing against the gray afternoon to being a light. He sat in the booth. He sat across from where he had sat before, in the seat Clarence had occupied that Tuesday 5 years ago. Ruth brought hot chocolate without being asked. The same thick white mug. The ceramic snowman was chipped now at one ear, a small casualty of years, but still there. He wrapped both hands around it, looked at the window. The snow was not falling today. The sky was the clear, cold blue of a January afternoon that has decided to be bright instead of heavy. A woman walked past on the side street with a child on her hand, moving at the child's pace, which was half of hers. He placed both palms flat on the table. The gesture came naturally. He did not plan it. His hands simply came to rest that way, open, steady, connected to the surface, and he recognized it only after it had happened. Recognized it as the gesture of a man who has heard something important and is giving himself a moment to receive it properly before he responds. He sat in the corner booth for a long time. Ruth did not disturb him. The heater ticked its quiet ticks. The street lamp held its light. He thought about what it meant to be one link in a chain that you did not forge and cannot see the end of, to receive something from a man who received it from his father, to pass it forward to strangers who will pass it forward to strangers of their own. He thought about Henry Webb, dead, 64 years, teaching his son a knot in a cold kitchen in eastern Kentucky. He thought about that 12-year-old boy, now 81, then dead, who had carried that knot across 7 decades to a sidewalk in January, where another 12-year-old happened to be watching. He thought about Antoine in Belleville doing homework at a kitchen table. He thought about Jess at the office on Delmar right now, taking a call from a school counselor in Ferguson about a girl who had stopped coming home. He thought about Devin, who could hold a silence. He thought about a door that locks from the inside. The Teamster's Bow. It was not just the name of a knot or an organization or even a philosophy. It was the name of a specific kind of decision, the small one made quickly in the cold, in front of a stranger who needs something you have. The decision that most people don't make because they are busy or uncertain, or because they have decided that the stranger is someone else's responsibility. The decision that, when made, travels further than anyone standing on that corner could have imagined. Marcus Elliott finished his hot chocolate. He left enough money on the table for the drink, in the time, and the particular warmth of a place that had held something important without being asked to. He picked up his coat. He said goodbye to Ruth, who waved from behind the counter without looking up from her newspaper, exactly as she always had. He pushed through this door. The bell rang its tired ring. Outside, the air was cold and clear, the kind of cold that sharpens rather than numbs. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in front of the pharmacy, 2 doors down, in roughly the place where a boy had once knelt on a January afternoon to tie a stranger's shoe. He looked at the storm drain at the curb. Still there, still doing what it had always done. He looked at the bench across the sidewalk. Empty now. He looked up at the sky, the winter blue of it, the clear, cold, indifferent blue of a city sky in January that belongs to no one and everyone, the sky under which most of the city's small, invisible moments happen and dissolve without record. Most of them. He put on his coat. He turned and walked back toward the car and drove back to the office on Delmar, where Jess was on the phone and Devin was making coffee, and the telephone on the desk had already rung twice since he left. He went inside. He picked up the phone. He waited for the right moment to speak, and then he listened.